and talk about the undeniable concern, rising concern, in fact, about the rate of sexual abuse at the country schools now coming to light in Limpopo specifically. A 50-year-old teacher appeared in court on Monday after allegedly raping a 17-year-old girl on several occasions. Meanwhile, the South African Human Rights Commission is currently holding hearings into bullying, corporal punishment and sexual abuse and so-called sexual relations between educators and pupils in that province. Sheniece Linderboom is an education attorney with Section 27. She joins us now to talk more about this, Sheniece. So, worrying detail coming out from those hearings in Limpopo this week. I was looking at a quote earlier in the Mail and Guardian where a pupil represented through an NGO said, and these are primary school pupils, by the way, that how some of this harassment happens is that often because they're too short to reach the chalkboard, a teacher would lift them up and use that as an opportunity to touch them indecently or even look up their skirts in some cases. Are you shocked by any of this?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you know, this is what we've been seeing. Section 27 has been working on sexual violence in schools since about 2012. And it's just terrible, especially when we're considering these are educators that are acting in loco parentis. They're acting in the role of parents when we send our children to school. And this is what, this is the danger that these learners are having to be exposed to on a daily basis. The numbers are just, it's scary. I think what we've seen is the department itself has exceeded that this is a significant problem. What goes unreported is another situation. But it really is not an isolated issue. And unfortunately, throughout the country, we are seeing incidences that range from sexual harassment all the way to, like you've mentioned, incidences of rapes by educators.
And why isn't there sufficient concern, sufficient noise, sufficient efforts to address the sexual abuse of pupils?
When I say I think that there are various factors that come into play. When I mentioned the department has conceded the fact that this is a serious problem, this has come out of the protocol that they have actually released on the management and reporting of sexual violence and sexual harassment in schools. So this is a policy, the protocol that has been finalized. And I think we're seeing issues of whether not all the educators, not all the schools have been made aware of this protocol. And this is aside from the existing laws which permit any sort of sexual violence, against learners or young children. So we've seen these protocols. We don't know if the educators are aware of it. We don't know if it's been implemented properly. From our experiences, we've also heard that schools would opt to protect the educators for fear of the impact on the reputation of the school. So there are various factors that come into play in the non-implementation of the proper reporting mechanisms that are in place.
And I want to go back to that submission that I paraphrased sort of earlier in our conversation from the Commission for Gender Equality in Limpopo, and I want to just repeat that for people who may have missed it. The Mail and Guardian capturing this quote saying, one time they engaged with an NGO in the Vambe district in Limpopo. They were working with primary school pupils and they asked them, what are some of the ways in which sexual harassment can manifest in schools? And a child, listen to this, who's in grade 3 or 4, said to the facilitator, quote, a chalkboard. And the facilitator asked, how can a chalkboard contribute to sexual harassment in schools? And the learner said this, because we cannot reach the chalkboard, teachers live to be able to write on the chalkboard, lift us up, but in the process, they put their fingers inside our panties. And I want to pick up on the phrasing, sexual harassment. Is that even an adequate enough phrase, a term, to be using for that kind of violation?
Well, in my understanding, it would be further where it would go to sexual assaults because there's some physical assault that's coming into play, physical sexual assault that's coming into play. Yeah, the stories that we've heard and that we've been exposed to is really terrible, and this is one of them as well. Also, part of our work is we do sort of sexual violence workshops in schools, which we've actually done some in the Limpopo province, and it's scary to hear some of the questions that the learners will ask, insinuating that actually they're unclear about. Something happened to me, but I don't know what exactly that is. So there definitely needs to be more education on the subject. I know that there is CSE happening in the schools, which sort of breaks down what sexual abuse is, what rape is, what sexual assault is, and many NGOs are also doing, individual work of workshops in schools and trying to educate and advocate for awareness around these issues. But it definitely needs to be escalated, and especially from training on the educator side and understanding. We have a case that we're actually hoping to launch quite soon, which would speak to the fact that this is not an isolated issue, and calling on the role players, the educators, the school, the district officials, to take the steps that they need to, because we see the impact of these incidences. They live with these learners, with these children forever. And that's not something that can be taken lightly. It really is something that needs to be stepped up. I appreciate the Human Rights Commission's task, and if it's still the early stages of these hearings that they're conducting, but I think they're in for quite, shocking stories that might come through to them if the learners feel brave enough to speak about what's going on.
And also quite shocking in the report, the article I was referencing earlier is claimed by some of the people who've made submissions to these Human Rights Commission hearings that the other problem that they're facing in trying to address the abuse, sexual abuse of pupils by teachers is that the labour unions defend teachers at all costs. Is that something that you have encountered, that even when teachers are accused of sexual violation, the unions still stick up for them?
Yes, unfortunately, that is something that we have seen. Like I said, we've seen schools being resistant to even report the incident themselves, as they're required to do, for fear of damaging their reputation. Then you have incidences of unions protecting their members. Granted, everybody is entitled to, voice their side of the story, and due process needs to be followed. It can be a little bit disheartening when we're going along these processes and, when we clearly have facts of, incidents of sexual violence and it's being defended. So, we need to see these role players stepping up and playing the parts that they need to. For example, also the Council for Educators, which is the council that sort of governs and manages the educators within their field. Maybe it needs to be stricter sanctions so these perpetrators are not going out and teaching in other schools. There's also then the issue of, going on the child offenders register. So there's so many factors that come into play, lest we mention also the criminal process, which, as we know, can be a very slow and painful process.
And you also have
these various factors that come in and impact the moving and seeing accountability and action and justice being served in these instances.
You also have the added horror, I wanted to say, of pupils sexually violating others.
And this we have seen, and I think you can appreciate that it is a little bit more complicated because it's often minor on minor, these can be a little bit tricky to deal with. But there are steps that need to be followed in terms of disciplinary action against perpetrators, whether they be minor children, and I think it's just the way that it's handled is more sort of understanding or more accommodating to the minor that is the perpetrator. I think we've seen a few cases that we've dealt with, and it can get a little bit more complicated when it is learner on learner, but definitely needs to make sure that due process is followed in terms of, the disciplinary steps.
Sheniece Linderboom, thank you so much for speaking to us on what is a horrific topic. She's an education attorney with Section 27.